Good morning. Can you guys hear me okay? That's good? Okay. Well, welcome. We're so glad to see you all. This is our 6th annual Keep Moving Symposium, and we are glad to see you, whether you're a longtime DAPS member or whether you are new. Can I just get a show of hands of folks that are here for the first time? Wonderful, wonderful. We are very, very glad to see you. We have got a great day ahead of you with some wonderful experts. Today, you're going to find new information, a greater understanding of Parkinson's disease, and most importantly, a compassionate community. We want to provide you with as many tools as possible to add to your toolbox so that your journey with Parkinson's can be faced with courage, hope, and resiliency. DAPS is committed to helping people with Parkinson's disease live well with Parkinson's. So DAPS has been serving the North Texas area for 44 years. Our services range from educational programs to exercise and speech to non-contact boxing, dance, and support. This year, we have expanded our outreach services with the addition of our community liaison, Baylin Bland Sochiwa. Baylin has spoken about DAPS and Parkinson's at over 50 community events, neurology clinics, assisted living facilities, Rotary clubs, and senior and recreation centers since March of this year. Education and outreach to both professionals and our neighbors is a critical piece in providing the Parkinson's community with the free support and services that DAPS offers virtually and throughout the Metroplex. DAPS aims to accommodate people with Parkinson's by offering services in locations that are within their community. Meeting together in community with others enables friendships and support to develop with others, like yourselves, who are on a journey with Parkinson's disease. DAPS now delivers many classes and programs virtually to enable participation by our neighbors who are more mobilely challenged. No one needs to travel on the Parkinson's journey alone. This month, we are delighted to announce the expansion of our educational programs to Denton County in order to provide additional information, resources, and support. These monthly educational opportunities will offer free presentations on things like speech, exercise, Parkinson's, and nutrition. If you'd like more information, you can find all these details at the DAPS table that is in front of the sanctuary. DAPS has also responded to the request for more support with the addition of an online Parkinson's support group. This service conveniently reaches people no matter where they live and regardless of their physical limitations. Connecting with others, whether it be virtually or in person, helps address the isolation and loneliness that is all too common within the Parkinson's community. So before I introduce our platinum sponsors, I'd like just to take a moment to recognize our tiny but very mighty staff. Amber Shevlin joined us in July as our office administrative coordinator, and she has gone above and beyond in overseeing things like our mailings, our printed materials, signage, and our internal processes. I've shared with you how Baylin's new role as the community liaison has allowed DAPS to reach more people and professionals dealing with Parkinson's since March. And Keisha Hill, as you have all seen, joined us in the midst of planning for monthly educational series and today's Keep Moving event. Her hard work and commitment to DAPS is evident by all. Please join me in thanking this dynamic team along with all of our fantastic volunteers for their dedication and determination to serve the Parkinson's community with compassion. All right, and finally, I am very, very thankful for our sponsors that have made this event possible. I would like to introduce our platinum sponsors right now and just give each of those folks a couple of minutes to speak before our program begins. So please welcome Julia Haymore with Acadia.
Good morning. I think we should all give Leisha a round of applause too, because she's doing a great job. So I don't really have any prepared remarks necessarily. I just want to say that we're here to advocate for you guys. We're over there in the front, my partner and I, Laura, and what we do, just to give you an idea, is our role is to basically inform the medical community, which is mostly neurology, as you could well imagine, about our medication, which is Nuplazid, and it is for Parkinson's disease psychosis, which really just means hallucinations and delusions that are associated with Parkinson's disease. And while that may be a common symptom of advancing Parkinson's disease, not everyone is aware of that possibly coming up. And so we just want to make sure that we're educating everyone and letting you know that should something like that occur in your family, we're happy to help. So please come by and see us, and we'll have some information over there for you.
Thank you, Julia. And Julia has been around and been a great partner to DAPS for many, many years, so you may have seen. Next, I would like to introduce Kiowa Kieran. They're one of our newer sponsors and have already jumped in headfirst and been a fabulous partner in our community. So it brings me great pleasure to introduce you to Kelly Broussard with Kiowa Kieran.
Good morning, y'all. I don't have anything prepared either, but I wanted to say hello and again thank Leisha for all the hard work and her staff. Kiowa Kieran, I've been with them for about a year, and I was so excited to join a company that when they say they help support patients, they really do that and put their money where their mouth is. So it's been a pleasure to partner with DAPS, and it feeds my soul. I think if I could do that full time, I would. But use us, let us help you get the knowledge and help you need, and we're so, so blessed and so grateful to be a part of your journey.
Thank you, Kelly. And last but not least, I would like to introduce you to Peter. He is with Supernus, and Supernus has also been a longtime sponsor and supporter for DAPS. So Peter, come on up. He is new to Fort Worth area.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. I'm actually taking over for the Dallas rep who decided to go to a wedding instead. So, no, I can't be more excited to be here. Thank you, DAPS, for, obviously the partnership that it seems like we've had for quite some time. I've been with Supernus for just over a year now. I do cover the Fort Worth territory all the way out to West Texas, but it's really, really great to see everybody here. I know it's not easy probably getting out and coming out and doing these education things, but I know from all the people that are here and all the vendors and companies, we really appreciate y'all coming to learn. Quickly, I've got two products. Supernus has got two PD products. One is GoCovery. That is our extended release amantadine indicated for both dyskinesia and off time. And then we have Apokyn, which is our acute rescue and bridge medication. All three of our booths are right up front. Would love to come and have conversations with y'all. I know I've talked to some of y'all already. If you haven't swung by, come please grab candy off my table. It's sitting there, and I've ate like 5 pieces, so I don't need any more. So again, thank you PD community, and look forward to talking to y'all.
Thank you so much. And just a reminder, immediately behind you are the restrooms. At any given time, if you need to stand up, if you need to move, if you need to get some water, please do so. We are not too formal here, so please make yourselves comfortable. So we're ready to get started with our program, and I'm really excited to introduce to you our very first speaker. So Mazen Elkurd is the Director of Movement Disorders Program at Baylor University Medical Center. Dr. Elkurd is a board-certified neurologist with additional fellowship training in movement disorders from UT Southwestern Medical Center. He has strong interest in Parkinson's disease, tremors, dystonia, and other movement disorders. Dr. Elkurd has published numerous peer-reviewed papers in the area of movement disorders. He participates in education of medical students and residents, and he is engaged in numerous professional organizations, locally, nationally, and internationally. Dr. Elkurd is also an active member of the DAPS Medical Advisory Board, where he has written articles for our monthly newsletter. He has participated in roundtables and actively worked to help DAPS provide services to the underserved populations in South Dallas. Please help me welcome Dr. Elkurd.
Thank you so much for that great introduction, Leisha. It's a great pleasure to be here and to speak in front of this amazing audience. It's so nice to see so many faces and everybody out and about for a number of reasons. So I have the great pleasure of starting off this amazing program, and I hope to be able to give you a nice overview of Parkinson's disease, just kind of the lay of the land, if you will. And so, as Leisha said, my name is Mazen Elkurd. I'm a movement disorder specialist. Currently have the privilege of starting a new movement disorder program at Baylor, Scott and White, at Baylor University Medical Center in downtown Dallas. Excited to give this talk now. So, just a quick overview of what I hope to talk about. You know, I'm going to start out talking about the history of Parkinson's disease, how we learned about it, how it came to be, going into the understanding of Parkinson's disease today and the current philosophy behind the science and background of Parkinson's disease. And then we'll start talking about how we address Parkinson's disease and how we treat it. And then we'll finish off by talking about what lays in store for the future of Parkinson's disease. So some of this will get down into the weeds and you know, get really technical, but I know that this audience is a really well-educated one. Parkinson's patients tend to be, you know, extremely well-educated on their condition, and I hope that this kind of enhances that understanding a little bit further. And I hope that at the end we'll have a few minutes for some questions and answers if anybody has some additional questions. So this is where a lot of people start with their discussion of the history of Parkinson's disease. This is the seminal paper written by James Parkinson in 1817. It was titled An Essay on the Shaking Palsy. And James Parkinson was a British physician in London. He essentially saw people, both in his practice and out and about in the community, that had these typical characteristics that hadn't really been well described, or at least fully described before. People that walked with stooped posture, walked slowly, and had some tremors, among some other features. And so Dr. Parkinson's work on this paper serves as kind of the fundamental beginning of our modern understanding of Parkinson. But it's certainly not the beginning. You really could go all the way back to prehistory in talking about Parkinson's disease. Certain papyrus scripts from ancient Egypt and even Ayurvedic texts going back thousands and thousands of years describe symptoms that sound a whole lot like what we know today to be Parkinson's disease. That understanding evolved around 175 AD. Galen published or wrote some manuscripts at the time that again described some disorders with gait changes that sound a lot like what we know today as Parkinson's disease. And then finally, 1917 is where we have our first full modern manuscript of the essay on the shaking palsy that we now today know as Parkinson's disease. And that date is incorrect. I believe it was in the 1817 was James Parkinson. 1862 was the time of Jean-Martin Charcot. And Jean-Martin Charcot was who we today refer to as the father of neurology. He really established the field of neurology as we know it today. And in his work, he essentially coined the term Parkinson's disease for what was previously called the shaking palsy. And then in 1919, it was the first discovery of the substantia nigra, the part of the brain that is responsible for producing dopamine. In 1968 was the first large-scale treatment with levodopa. In 1979, the first animal model for the research of Parkinson's disease came about. So finally, research opportunities exploded at that time. 1997, the first genes associated with Parkinson's disease were discovered. At 2002, DBS finally received its first indication for Parkinson's disease. In 2012, the first immunotherapy for Parkinson's disease began clinical trials. And obviously, that story and saga continues into today. So what is Parkinson's disease, this entity that we're all here gathered today to talk about? So Parkinson's disease, at its essence, is a neurodegenerative disease. It is a slowly progressive neurodegenerative condition that, among other things, causes a decrease in dopamine production in the brain, leading to decline in motor function, and later on, additional symptoms. Parkinson's disease is a disorder that is increasing in prevalence and very prevalent overall. It affects over 1 million people in the United States and over 4 million people worldwide. 13 out of every 100,000 people in the United States are affected, and we see approximately 60,000 new cases in the United States every single year. So we know what Parkinson's disease looks like, who it affects, but why does it happen? What causes it? So this is a really complex question. There's no real single answer. A lot of people ask me, the first thing that comes to people's mind, well, is this hereditary? Is this something that's inherited? And the answer to that is, again, it's complex, but the majority of the time, that's not the case. So as it turns out, only about 10% of cases of Parkinson's disease have a 1-to-1 inheritance. That means that you have a gene for Parkinson's disease, whether it's an autosomal dominant or recessive, and that causes you to get the disease. The other 90% of cases falls into this sporadic category for Parkinson's disease. And so that sporadic category has this really complex pattern of causality. It's a combination of environmental factors, some genetic components that may predispose somebody, and then some factors related to aging in and of itself. So 90% have the sporadic inheritance pattern, and then 10% are purely inherited. So the end result, no matter what the cause is, whether it was environmental or purely genetic, the end result is this. There are these proteins that are found in our natural brain cells. So proteins are essentially the machinery of our cells. They're how our cells do the work that they're supposed to do. And proteins are extremely abundant, obviously, throughout the body. There is a certain protein called alpha-synuclein. And up until recently, we really didn't understand what it even did. And there's still some questions, but we think it's involved in trafficking of information across or through cells. Well, what it turns out happens is these proteins that are supposed to conform in a certain pattern to do their job, they start to misfold. They look different than what they're supposed to. And those misfolded proteins clump together, and they form these toxic clumps called Lewy bodies. And these Lewy bodies end up being deposited in a part of the brain called the substantia nigra, which is in the midbrain. So I don't think my pointer is really working too well, but the midbrain is deep down in the brain where all the fibers essentially converge. And this substantia nigra, that dark pigmented region of the midbrain, is where dopamine is produced. And it turns out that these Lewy bodies really start to form the most in these brain cells in the substantia nigra, and that leads to decline in dopamine production over time, the more that this process occurs. But there's more to the story than that. How did those proteins get there? And until fairly recently, it was really thought that this was purely a disorder of the central nervous system. This is something that occurs in the brain, as would stand to reason, since this is a neurologic disease. But it turns out there's a lot more complex of a story to it than that. The pathology of Parkinson's disease, it turns out, does not start in the brain, but in fact starts in the enteric nervous system of the gut. This is a very new field of science that's still being understood and explored, and so we still don't know a whole lot about it. But what we know is that something happens in the gut. There is some sort of change that occurs that causes these abnormalities with alpha-synuclein to occur. These affect the nerves in the enteric nervous system in the gut, and that abnormality moves up the vagus nerve and eventually makes its way up to the substantia nigra. And this process, in fact, can start decades before the emergence of symptoms of Parkinson's disease. And the end result is this: the symptoms of Parkinson's disease, which are the decrease in facial expression. We call that masked facial expression or hypomimia. There's decreased tone of voice, which we call hypophonia. There's a stooped posture. There's rigidity in the muscles, and tremors, slowness with walking, shuffling, and difficulties with balance. But that's really just the tip of the iceberg. Those are the symptoms that we see outwardly, but there's this whole other world of symptoms of Parkinson's disease that's not seen and often not discussed. These include autonomic symptoms like problems with constipation, problems with urinary function, problems with blood pressure regulation. There are mood changes. People with Parkinson's disease are well known to have a higher chance for depression and anxiety. Problems with certainly memory can occur, although they're not universal, and difficulties with hallucinations and delusions, among some other symptoms. So it's a disease that truly affects the whole body. It is not purely a movement disorder. So Parkinson's disease is really heterogeneous. What does that word mean, heterogeneous? It means that it's very different from person to person. There is no two cases of Parkinson's disease that are alike. So it's really difficult to predict how a single case will evolve over time. So oftentimes my patients ask me, well, how long do I have before I have this symptom? Or how long do I have before I have trouble walking? Or, what is the future going to look like? And that's just a really almost impossible question to answer because it's just so different from person to person. But we can look at trends. We can look at what things look like on average. And on average, we know that, again, this disease starts up to 2 decades before it's ever diagnosed. And so that's the beginning marker there, the -20. That's when people might start to develop the symptoms that we often don't really associate with Parkinson's disease or are never even thought of as anything related to Parkinson's disease. Problems with constipation, problems with loss of sense of smell, things that are just relatively mundane and go pretty unnoticed for most people. Some people then start to develop sleep disorders. A common one is what's called REM sleep behavior disorder, and this is a problem where people may start to act out their dreams. This is really confusing to some people because they wonder what does that mean? And acting out your dreams is essentially when you're asleep and you're moving in your sleep in reaction to what you're dreaming about. This often is accompanied by vivid dreams or nightmares, and again, can happen years before the onset of any motor symptoms of Parkinson's disease. And so then, around the time of diagnosis, time point 0, that's when we start to develop the motor symptoms, and that's the tremor, the rigidity, and the slowness. It's important to note, though, that not every patient with Parkinson's disease has tremor. That's often one of the most visible symptoms of Parkinson's disease, and it's the one that's most associated for a lot of people with Parkinson's disease. But a lot of people with Parkinson's don't have any tremor at all. The hallmark of Parkinson's disease, the main symptom that really signifies Parkinson's disease is what's called bradykinesia, which is problems with coordination of movement and being unable to perform these large amplitude movements. So that's what starts early on, and as you can see, for the first 7 to 10 years, again, this is a really broad average, and it's very different from person to person, but the first sort of decade or so, people have symptoms that are in what's considered early stages. Symptoms can be generally controlled, and they don't have a whole lot of the symptoms associated with complications of treatment. So these typically come on in that second phase of the disease, and that's when people may start to develop problems with mood and behavior and cognitive function, and certainly the motor symptoms increase, and often that's the point where people may start to have more difficulties with gait and balance. So this is a very general guide of what things may look like for somebody with Parkinson's disease, but it's, again, really important to remember that it's very different from person to person. So we've talked about what Parkinson's disease is, what we think causes it, and what the symptoms are. So how do we treat Parkinson's disease? So this is really best looked at in two broad categories. There's symptomatic treatment. That's basically medications that essentially just treat the symptoms, and then disease-modifying therapies. These are treatments that slow down or reverse the symptoms of Parkinson's disease. And so as you can see in that disease-modifying category, the only thing that we have currently available is physical exercise. And that's really important. Physical exercise is, in fact, the only intervention that's been proven to date to slow down the progression of Parkinson's disease. There are lots of other therapies that are promising, and there's a lot of research that's going on. So this includes those immunotherapies, genetic therapies, stem cell therapies, and other novel molecule medications. And we'll talk about those and what they are at the end, but none of these are currently available, and they're still in various stages of research. But exercise has been proven time and time again in multiple different studies to slow down the progression of symptoms. So short of a disease-modifying therapy, these are the ways that we address the symptoms. We use dopamine replacement therapies to increase the amount of dopamine that's available in a person's brain, or to mimic dopamine in some cases. We use adjunct medications. So these are medicines that sort of help as add-ons and can sometimes address other non-motor symptoms of Parkinson's disease. And certainly we have things like physical therapy, speech therapy, occupational therapy, which will be discussed in a lot more detail today. We have neuromodulatory treatments. These are things like deep brain stimulation and high-intensity focused ultrasound, which again will be discussed in more detail by some of the other presenters today. So the first and foremost thing that we always talk about is dopamine replacement therapy. And so that essentially means you're trying to replenish or replace that dopamine that's been lost in a person with Parkinson's disease, because their brain is no longer able to produce sufficient quantities of dopamine. And so it's important to understand the role of dopamine in the brain. Dopamine is essentially a chemical transmitter of information in the brain. And dopamine is really important for the coordination of movement. You can think of it as sort of fuel to the fire of movement. Without dopamine, movement is very difficult to initiate and coordinate. And so the way we can do that is through these three categories of medication: carbidopa-levodopa, dopamine agonist, and MAOB inhibitors. That one doesn't roll off the tongue. So what is carbidopa-levodopa? So first off, I guess we might ask, why wouldn't we just give somebody just dopamine? Why go through all these other different treatments? And the short answer is you can't. If you give a person pure dopamine in tablet form or intravenous form, it would cause horrible side effects. It would cause a person's blood pressure to bottom out, severe nausea, and a whole slew of other symptoms. In fact, dopamine is used in ICU settings to support people who are critically ill. So you can't just give dopamine because the systemic effects of dopamine outside of the brain are not good, and that's not where it's needed. So to really bypass that, we give a person levodopa. And what levodopa is it's an immediate precursor to dopamine, so this is kind of that chemical structure of levodopa. And so the body can take levodopa and can turn it into dopamine. But that still leaves us with the same problem. If you turn levodopa into dopamine in the bloodstream, in the body, you're going to have the same issues as you would with just giving pure dopamine. And so that's where carbidopa comes in. Carbidopa blocks this enzyme called AADC, and that prevents that conversion of levodopa to dopamine in the bloodstream. But levodopa can get into the brain, whereas carbidopa can't. So in the brain, levodopa alone, without the hindrance of carbidopa, can get turned into dopamine, and you have dopamine in the brain, no dopamine in the rest of the body, and you have control of symptoms. So it's really the closest we can get, the best treatment that you can achieve, short of a disease-modifying therapy, is levodopa. And that's why, since the 1960s, it's been the gold standard. But this is often the issue with carbidopa-levodopa. A lot of people think, well, if I start it early, then it may not help me later on, but that's, in fact, no longer believed to be true. We know that it's not necessarily a factor of how early you start it, but just how advanced the disease is. And so at whatever point you start the medication, you're going to pop into the middle of this graph. And what this graph is showing is the therapeutic window of levodopa. So one of the big challenges with levodopa, as many people here in the audience probably know and experience, is what are called motor fluctuations. So motor fluctuations are this problem where the dopamine level is either too low and a person has what are called off symptoms, and that's the symptoms of Parkinson's, the slowness and the tremor, etc. Or the dose is too high and they have dyskinesia. And dyskinesia is this problem where you have excessive involuntary random movement of the body. And that's not necessarily a problem in the beginning. The graph here shows you the dopamine concentration in the body. And so when you take a dose, the dopamine level goes up and then it goes down. But early in the disease, you have a pretty wide therapeutic window because you still have some dopamine brain cells. They're able to take that dopamine, they're able to reprocess it, and your brain hasn't become super sensitized to dopamine. And so a single dose can last 4 or 5 hours, and even if that level kind of fluctuates a little bit, you're still well controlled. But as the disease progresses, that therapeutic window starts to narrow. So that same dose, within that dose, you can fluctuate from on to off, and that problem kind of just increases and increases and increases over time. And so there are certainly ways that we've looked at, and there have been very innovative therapies that have been developed over the years to try to address this issue. So that explains the reason for all these different forms of carbidopa-levodopa that are on the market. So obviously we still have the regular carbidopa-levodopa, that's what's called IR, also known as Sinemet. It comes in a form called Parcopa, which is the same thing that just dissolves in the mouth. And then there's Divi, which is a new form of carbidopa-levodopa that just it's the same thing, but you can divide it more easily to take a half or a quarter of a tablet. Then you have the next version that came out. This was introduced, I believe, in the late 80s or early 90s. It's a coated tablet form of carbidopa-levodopa. So that basically is the Sinemet CR there on the graph. So it essentially extends the duration just a little bit. It's not a whole lot better than the regular carbidopa-levodopa. You can combine carbidopa-levodopa with another medicine that we'll talk about in just a little bit called entacapone to, again, make it last even longer. So that kind of extends it just a little bit further. And then now there's a carbidopa-levodopa extended release capsule branded as Rytari, and that really extends that duration out significantly to 5-6 hours. And then for people who really have these very significant fluctuations, there's a carbidopa-levodopa intestinal infusion where the medicine is put into a gel form and that's infused directly into the intestine to really keep it to a very steady level in the body. And then most recently, there's a inhaled form of levodopa. It's levodopa alone. This is used as a rescue therapy for people who have sudden off times. Instead of going through the GI tract and waiting for that ramp-up time, a person's able to inhale that medicine into the lungs, and that medicine is absorbed very quickly within 10, 15 minutes. So this is that carbidopa-levodopa intestinal gel formulation. So as you can see, that graph, the first half shows the problem with those motor fluctuations that I described earlier, and the intestinal gel therapy kind of tries to even that out by really infusing very small amounts consistently. The device works really well, but it does require a tube to be implanted into the body, going through the abdominal wall into the proximal small intestine. So that's essentially carbidopa-levodopa, and that's, for many people, the best therapy that's available. But there's this whole other class of medicines called dopamine agonists. And dopamine agonists have sort of come and gone a little bit as preferred therapies for Parkinson's disease. Certainly there's still a role for them, and many people still like to use them. But they're doing something a little different than levodopa. Levodopa is turned into dopamine, and it works essentially just like dopamine does naturally. These dopamine agonists, as you can see here, they have different chemical structures. They don't look just like dopamine itself, which looks like that there on the right. So these look a little bit different. They sort of fool the dopamine receptors into thinking they're dopamine, but not exactly all the way. So there are different dopamine receptors in the brain, and these activate them in a different pattern. And so it turns out their effects are not exactly the same as dopamine. There are some really good advantages to these dopamine agonist therapies. They can last a lot longer. Some of these can be used once a day or twice a day. Some of them come in a patch form that doesn't require any oral absorption, and they bypass that problem of oral absorption. But there are certainly some downsides. They can come with more of the side effects of too much dopamine. Those can include problems with impulse control disorders, hallucinations, lightheadedness, sleep attacks. Certainly these don't occur with everyone, but there's just a higher chance of these side effects occurring with dopamine agonists than they do with levodopa, especially in elderly people. Then we have MAO-B inhibitors. So monoamine oxidase is an enzyme in the body, and an enzyme is a chemical that does a certain job, and this enzyme, MAO, is responsible for breaking down neurotransmitters. And when you block MAO, so it's an MAO-B inhibitor, when you block MAO, you stop the breakdown of chemicals. So MAO-B is that particular subset that breaks down dopamine. And so by blocking it, you basically are just allowing there to be more dopamine left around. So you're not adding any new dopamine into the equation. You're just kind of preserving what's already there a little bit longer. So these drugs can be really good in early stages because their benefit alone is relatively modest, but they're just once a day. They're really generally pretty well tolerated. But in later stages, they're more useful as add-on therapies to really enhance levodopa or some other therapies because their effect alone is not very strong for people with more advanced disease. There was some discussion a couple of decades ago as to whether some of these medications could have a disease-modifying benefit, whether it could slow down the disease. a couple of very large trials were done at the time looking at that question. The end result was inconclusive, and it was never approved for that. So there was never any definitive proof that they were able to accomplish that goal. And these are the treatments that are what are now called rescue therapies. This is a really new arena in Parkinson's disease therapy. Only in the past few years have we started to have these rescue therapies come online as an option. And so these are for people that have those motor fluctuations, and despite all our best efforts to control them, people still have some occasionally here and there. And so these therapies will kick in very quickly to eliminate that off time, but they don't last very long, so that when you take your next dose, you're not overdosed. And so the first one that came on was the Apokin pen. So this is the dopamine agonist known as apomorphine that's injected into the skin. There's the Inbrija inhaler, which is that levodopa inhaled form. And then the newest one is Kinmobi, which is the same medicine as Apokin, apomorphine, but in a sublingual strip, kind of like a Listerine strip is the way I describe it. It just goes under your tongue and dissolves in the mouth. And so these are dopamine replacement therapies that are quick on but don't last very long, just to bridge the gap for these off times. There's a lot of treatments for Parkinson's disease, as you guys are seeing, which is a good thing, but it also makes things, that's why we have people that just treat Parkinson's, because it's really complex. But these are all the other medications that are available, adjunct therapies. So these are medicines that are add-ons. They're not used really by themselves for Parkinson's disease, but they're useful as add-on treatments. So these are medicines like amantadine, which comes in ER forms like Gocovri and Osmolex. There's these COMT inhibitors. So COMT inhibitors, they extend the duration of levodopa. They kind of make it last longer. And so we have Ongentys or opicapone, which is a once a day, and then the older entacapone, which has to be taken multiple times a day. There's a new medicine called istradefylline or Nurians, which is a new medicine that works in a whole new way that was never used in Parkinson's disease before. It targets these adenosine A2A receptors, and it helps increase a person's on time. Nuplazid or pimavanserin is used just for the treatment of Parkinson's disease-associated psychosis. And then there's this whole other class called anticholinergics, which used to be used a lot in the past. They were very effective for tremor, but they cause a lot of side effects, so they're hardly ever used anymore. And then obviously, there are non-pharmacologic treatments for symptomatic therapy. And I'm not going to go into great detail about those because we have excellent expert speakers on these topics that are going to be presenting later today. But these are extremely important therapeutic interventions for people with Parkinson's disease, often just as important as medication. So physical therapy, speech therapy, occupational therapy, and then certainly, again, exercise. I always emphasize that exercise and physical therapy are not the same thing at all. Physical therapy works on rehabilitation to try to restore somebody's function to a prior level, or to try to kind of stabilize their function. That's physical therapy, and exercise is meant to increase your endurance, to try to build your strength. It is a whole different thing. So you know, just because you're doing physical therapy doesn't mean you shouldn't also be exercising. You should always exercise. So the next category here is neuromodulation. And neuromodulation basically means changing the brain's electrical signals. So basically, this is treating Parkinson's disease without using medicine, by changing the way the brain cells are signaling each other, or talking to each other. And so there are two primary ways we do that. First is deep brain stimulation, or DBS. That's essentially like the pacemaker-like device for the brain. And that's been around since the early 2000s. and there's the high-intensity focused ultrasound therapy. And so this is a much newer therapy that doesn't require any implants or devices. And again, I'm not going to talk about these in details because we have an expert speaker on this. But a quick overview, this is deep brain stimulation. So this is a surgical therapy. Just like medicine, it's a symptomatic therapy. It is not a cure for Parkinson's disease, but it controls the symptoms much in the same way that medications do. It treats all the same symptoms that medications treat, but without the problems that we see with medications like the fluctuations and the on-off times. It's important to realize that not all symptoms can be addressed with deep brain stimulation. So anything that gets better with medicine will often get better with DBS. One exception to that is tremor often is resistant to medicine, but DBS can still help with that. But things like balance problems and other non-motor symptoms that medicine is not too helpful with, DBS often is not able to help with that much either. But for the right patient, this therapy can be a dramatic change in someone's life and allow them to really regain control over their life. And so right now, we're lucky to live in a time where there's this explosion in new technology for deep brain stimulation. So we have 3 devices that are currently available that are really versatile, allow lots of control, and we know that DBS can help people for many years into the future. So early on, when DBS was first introduced, it was thought of as a last resort therapy, something that was reserved until somebody is in really advanced stages of the disease. But over time, we've started to re-examine that and look at whether this could be helpful for people earlier on to give them more good time with Parkinson's disease. And it turns out large studies that have been done looking at this have shown that, in fact, DBS can be very helpful for people earlier in the disease, and it doesn't stop helping after some time. And a recent study from just about a year and a half ago, when it was published, looked at whether people with DBS or people on medicines alone 20 years out had any major differences. And they saw that people with DBS 20 years after their implant continued to perform better than those that were on medicines alone. So that then takes us to the research arena, new therapies that are on the horizon or under development. And so there are obviously new symptomatic therapies that are being developed, just like the therapies that we currently have available, medicines that just treat the symptoms, but hopefully do so better than what we have now. And then obviously what we're all hoping for, a medicine that slows down Parkinson's disease or reverses its progression. So these are some of the symptomatic therapies that are currently in development. So I'm going to try to pronounce some of these. Tavapadon is this new dopamine agonist, so just like the dopamine agonist that we have, but it's a new one that's promised to be better in terms of side effects and better tolerated. Currently, that's in phase 3 trials. That's the most advanced stage of clinical trials. So that one should be fairly close to some results to show whether it's going to be good or not. P2B001. So this uses 2 existing medicines that we already have on the market, pramipexole and rasagiline, but it combines them in low doses together into one pill to see if that works better than the 2 individually alone. And so this is just a way that, we're kind of repurposing some existing medications, and that's also in phase 3 trial. Apomorphine subcutaneous infusion. So that's the medicine that's in Apokyn and Inbrija, currently used as a rescue therapy, but instead of being used as needed on demand, because of its very kind of quick action, it can be used as a continuous infusion under the skin, kind of like an insulin pump that continuously delivers that medicine over time or throughout the day. This has actually been available in Europe since 1995, we're finally getting around to hopefully having this approved in the United States soon. So it's in phase 3 trial. I think the trial is concluded. We're waiting on regulatory approval. And then there's a carbidopa-levodopa infusion therapy that's being investigated. So same thing, it's like an insulin pump, and instead of taking carbidopa-levodopa pills or have it infused into the intestine with a tube, this would go with a little catheter right under the skin with a continuous infusion of levodopa. So this is still in phase 2 trial, so a little bit further out from coming to market. And then there's this KDT-3594. It's a very, very easy to remember name. It's a new dopamine agonist. Again, another way of doing the same thing, but hopefully with a newer molecule that may be better tolerated, and that's in phase 2 trials. But this is what we're really after, the holy grail, right? The disease-modifying therapy. So where are we with these treatments? So these are even easier to pronounce names. The CNM-AU8. This is a really interesting treatment. It's nanoparticles of gold that are given orally, and it's believed that these can help energize the cells by essentially powering or improving the function of mitochondria in the cells. And this is hoped will slow down the progression of Parkinson's disease by increasing energy stores in the brain cells. And so this is currently in phase 2 trials. There's a medicine called exenatide that's already on the market for diabetes, and it's a GLP-1 agonist, and it's currently being investigated for Parkinson's disease in phase 2 trials, again thought to potentially protect neurons from degradation from the damage that occurs to them, and so it's hoped that this could potentially slow down the progression of Parkinson's disease. Nilotinib is a leukemia drug. It's a medicine that's, again, been on the market for a long time and is being investigated currently in phase 2 trials, thought to hopefully be able to slow down the buildup of toxins in cells. And there's some conflicting evidence on this one, but there are multiple drugs in this category that are currently being investigated right now. And then there's a new experimental molecule called NPT-520-34. It's thought to reduce inflammation in cells, but that's very early in phase 1 clinical trials. So these are molecular therapies, so they're kind of like traditional medicines. It's not utilizing these new immunotherapies or genetic therapies. These are more traditional type medicines. So immunotherapies are medicines like what's really popular now for lots of different conditions, using antibodies to target things in the body that we don't want happening. And so there's prasinezumab is a monoclonal antibody that's targeted at that alpha-synuclein protein that's thought to be wreaking havoc on the cells, and it's currently in phase 2 trials. And then this other one, Afitope, it's an experimental vaccine against that phosphorylated alpha-synuclein, so it's hoped that by giving this to someone, it kind of protects from the buildup of these toxic clumps of abnormal proteins. Genetic therapies are also, very exciting in Parkinson's disease. There are obviously genetic forms of Parkinson's disease where these are a clear therapeutic target, but even in non-genetic forms, it's thought that some of these genetic therapies may be promising. And so this first one is a gene therapy that delivers the gene that's required for dopamine production. So essentially, it tells your body to start making more dopamine on its own. This is in phase 2 trials and is very, very promising. It would be a pretty incredible therapy. NT-Cell is a product that's being sponsored by the Michael J. Fox Foundation. It is a microcapsule that would be implanted into the brain to help regenerate the damaged tissues using genetic technology. So there are lots of trials out there, and there are new trials every day. They're always in various stages, whether it's enrollment or active study, or they're reviewing the data. So it's always hard to tell what studies are out, but there are these great resources that can help you look at studies if you're interested in participating in these clinical trials. You can always ask your neurologist. You can look at clinicaltrials.gov. Michael J. Fox Foundation and the Parkinson Foundation provide excellent resources. So hopefully we have a few minutes for any questions. Yes, sir. That's a great question. So there is a relationship. It turns out, so the question was whether there's a relationship between Parkinson's disease and Lewy body dementia. And the answer to that is yes. It turns out that Parkinson's disease and Lewy body dementia are both caused by the accumulation of Lewy bodies, which are caused by misfolding alpha-synuclein. So at its core, if you look at the cells under a microscope, it's actually the same disease. The difference is where those clumps of abnormal Lewy bodies end up depositing. Whereas in Parkinson's disease, they tend to deposit mainly in the substantia nigra and cause the motor symptoms, and then later in the disease, they can progress to different parts of the brain and cause other symptoms, including cognitive symptoms in advanced stages. In dementia with Lewy bodies, the opposite is true. It starts out as a more global disease and it affects the cortical portions of the brain. And so it's essentially really the same disease, but caused by a different spread of these Lewy bodies in a different pattern.
Can I ever ask a question one more time?
Yeah.
Are there any clinical trials being done right now in the Dallas-Fort Worth area?
So there are certainly always clinical trials occurring. It's really hard to tell you for sure off the top of my head. I don't have an active program right now with clinical trials at Baylor University Medical Center since I'm starting a new program there, but UT Southwestern certainly has a well-established research program that may have active clinical trials, but that's why these repositories like clinicaltrials.gov are really useful, because every clinical trial is required to be registered with the federal government, and by going on there, you're able to see whether there are any active ones in the area. One of the great things about being in this area is there are so many different groups and programs, and so it makes it hard to know for sure what's going on in the area, but these central databases can help you keep track and see what's available to you.
Do you have any experience with, or have you seen any interaction with other neurological diseases like Charcot-Marie-Tooth with Parkinson's disease?
Charcot-Marie-Tooth is a genetic disease that affects peripheral nerves in the body. And so to my knowledge, certainly there is no known relationship between Parkinson's disease and CMT. CMT affects the peripheral, mostly sensory and motor nerves in the body. whereas Parkinson's disease is something that mostly affects the central nervous system and also at times can affect the autonomic nervous system, but does not affect those peripheral nerves.
On average, how many clinical trials does it take for a therapy or a drug to be passed?
So there are three phases of clinical trials. Phase 1 clinical trials are the first phase that occurs in humans. So even before you get to phase 1, there are probably years, if not decades, of development to get to the point with preclinical models and animal models. So that can be, you know, a 5, 10, 15, 20-year process just to get to human clinical trials. Phase 1 of human clinical trials is when the drug or target therapy is being investigated in healthy volunteers to just make sure that it's safe to give to anybody and it's not harmful to the body. So there's usually at least one, if not two, phase 1 trials. Then phase 2 is when the medicine is given to individuals with the target disease, but it's still only being investigated for its safety and not for its benefit. And there's one, if not two of those. And then there's always 2 phase 3 trials, and those are what are called the pivotal trials that are required for investigating the benefit of the medicine. And the FDA, to approve a medicine, requires 2 successful phase 3 clinical trials. Okay.
What is the relationship of genetics to the development of Parkinson?
So the relationship between genetics and the development of Parkinson, that's something that we touched on a little bit at the beginning of the presentation. And so it's a very complex relationship. About 10% of cases have a direct relationship where you have a gene that's inherited to you, whether by autosomal recessive or dominant pattern, and that causes you to develop the disease. It's a 1-to-1 relationship. But the other 90% fall into what's called the sporadic Parkinson's disease category. And so these may involve, in some cases, genes that kind of just predispose you, but there has to be a second factor, often an environmental exposure, that triggers the disease. Thank you so much for your question. It's been a pleasure talking to you guys.
Thank you so much, Dr. Elkurd. I don't know if you guys felt like this, but I felt a little bit like I was at a buffet and I was looking through and discovering all these new options and things that I'd never tried before. So I hope that this will add to your toolbox so that you've got some more information that you can take with you. And I did just get information from Baylin. There are 4 clinical trials that are happening at UT Southwestern right now. Anytime we are notified at DAPS about new trials that are coming about, we typically either try to put that in our newsletter if we have space, but we also put it on all of our socials. So if you follow us on Facebook or Instagram or LinkedIn, those are also areas where we try to make sure you know that those are available. All right, so we are going to take a 15-minute break so that you have a chance to grab something to drink. You can go back and visit with the vendors and talk to them a little bit more, ask them about some of the studies that maybe we're just not aware of. So now you've got a lot of good questions. And make sure that you complete your passport because we do have a door prize at the end of the day. So if you complete that and drop it off in the picnic basket right behind us, then we will make that drawing at the end of the day. So we will see you back in 15 minutes and enjoy getting to know some of the vendors.